All right. All right. Record this for those folks who might not be able to make it tonight. So welcome everybody. If you were here last week, welcome back. If you missed last week, welcome for the first time. This is the Way of Spiritual Fortitude seminar series, being sponsored by 1001 New Worshiping Communities of the Presbyterian Church through the Presbyterian Mission Agency. My name is Jeff Eddings. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am coming to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the land of bridges. There's a beautiful that painting behind me was done by my family many years ago. That's the point of Pittsburgh. It was like paint by numbers thing my kids did when they were real small. And Pittsburgh has been home to the Adena tribe that built burial mounds here, as well as the Hopewell tribe, the Monongahela people, which one of our rivers is named after. The Shawnee, the Iroquois also have made their home here, as well as many other tribes. My role at 1001 is I'm the spiritual formation and coaching associate. So that's how I serve our new worshiping community leaders around the country. And as part of my role as spiritual formation, I wanted to put together this seminar series, really focusing on how spiritual leaders, pastors, can better care for themselves in order to serve and care for others. And in some conversations I've had since last week's conversation with folks, I know this doesn't just apply to pastors or spiritual leaders. I know this applies to people working with anybody in some sort of caring role, whether it's a teacher or a worker in the healthcare system. So, and I think what we're talking about tonight with Therese can be used by all of us to help kind of care for ourselves in a way before we're caring for others. And so I'm delighted to have Therese Taylor Stinson with us. Therese, let me say a few things about Therese, because Therese is many things. She's a spiritual director and a contemplative leader. She's a certified lay pastor caregiver in the PCUSA, right? In the Presbyterian Church. You are, and she's also an author, an award-winning author. Her most recent book, I think this is your most recent book, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around: Stories of Contemplation and Justice.
So we have three books. We have three books that are writings from the Spiritual Directors of Color Network. And Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around is the one I edited solo. But the first book, Embodied Spirits, I edited. And then the third book was edited by one of our board members, Anita Adesanya, and it's entitled Kaleidoscope, and it's our first attempt to actually create a curriculum for people of color around spiritual direction.
That's wonderful. And as Therese just mentioned, she's one of the founding members of the Spiritual Directors of Color Network. And she has a book coming out next year I'm really excited about, called Walking the Way of Harriet Tubman, Public Mystic and Freedom Fighter. And I'm not hopeful, I know we're going to talk a little bit about that and get a little bit into Harriet's story tonight. So Therese, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you really for having
appreciate
me.
it. Yeah. And could you just reintroduce yourself to folks as they've been coming in terms of where you're coming from and anything else you might want to say?
I just turned in the copy edited pages for the Harriet book. And when I got the copy edited pages, they said that it would publish in June. I think before that they told me April. So I'm sad it's June.
Yeah, that's all right. That's the way those things go.
Yes, I had fun copy editing the pages, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. I don't think you mentioned that I'm both an ordained deacon and a ruling elder in the PCUSA. My home is in National Capital Presbytery. I also served as a moderator actually I had a little bit of an extended term as moderator because during that time, we were about to change presbyters. And so they changed the terms of service, and that made those of us in that class stretch a little bit longer with that. I'm retired from the federal government. I've been retired 9 years from the federal government. I was a senior program analyst and an expert in federal regulatory activity. And also throughout my career, um, early on, before they had mediators doing that work, I was an EEO counselor, an equal employment opportunity counselor. And then even afterwards, and this is collateral duty, which means they don't pay you. It's volunteer work, but they let you do it for in place of the job that you get paid for. So they call it collateral duty. I was an equal employment opportunity, a lead mediator for those disputes for many years, and I'm still on the roster, though I don't have time to do that anymore.
Yeah, you don't sound too retired.
A lot of people say that to me. The difference
Yeah,
between my job and what I'm doing now is I'm doing, for the most part, what I want to do. And it's a joy. And as I was talking to someone earlier today, I'm also realizing that everything belongs, everything that I was doing before I retired, I am still doing those things, just in a different form.
Oh, that's wonderful. And last thing I will mention is that you're also a founding organizer of the Racial Awareness Festival, which
Yes.
just happened this past month, had its 6th year. So so grateful that you're taking some time to join us for this conversation, Therese. And before we get into it, I'd love to kind of help us all kind of get centered a little bit and use a writing of Howard Thurman's, which I'm sure we'll chat about a little bit tonight as well, to do that. One that many of you may be familiar with, how good it is to center down. So I invite you to just be with yourself. And I invite you to put down anything you might be holding, or whether your pens or papers, if you're going to take notes, or your cup of tea or whatever, and just breathe. And let us breathe together in this space. And I also invite you to try to put down whatever is running through your head from the course of this day. We're all coming to this place filled with all the things that we've been holding throughout this day. And I'm inviting you to put those down as well. And I'll read this writing, and then we will enter into a couple minutes of silence together. How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. With full intensity, we seek, ere the quiet passes, a fresh sense of order in our living, a direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are, and the questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis, and where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure, and what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life, and to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment. As we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note, which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being, our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down. Let us take a minute and center down in silence together. Forgot to introduce one last person. Molly. Molly is with me again tonight, helping. Molly, can you say hello? Let folks know who you are.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Molly Atkinson, here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I work closely with Jeff and the rest of the 1001 New Worshiping Communities team, which is a part of the Presbyterian Mission Agency in the Presbyterian Church USA. I'm also an ordained pastor and was previously serving a small church in Southern Indiana. I'm very happy to be with all of you tonight and look forward to being a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Molly. So Molly, occasionally I'll ask her to throw things into the chat as little kind of surveys to check in on different things. And I guess the first question I have for folks is just how centered down are you feeling today? So just as we begin this conversation, just on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you are centered, you are good, 1 being you haven't felt a bit centered all day long. What's your sense of being centered down today? So please drop your feelings into the chat. So Therese, as you know, you were here last week and talked about just the reason I wanted to kind of create a space of talking about a way of spiritual fortitude is just recognizing some things that are happening, things that are always true for pastors and spiritual leaders in terms of the stress they feel. The word burnout is thrown around a lot in our profession or in ministry circles. And then just how a pandemic and all the things happening in the world are just heightening that sense of stress and uncertainty. And then that coupled with the fact that, most spiritual leaders are not very prepared to care for themselves. We don't do a good job caring for ourselves. We take a pastoral care class in seminary that supposedly teaches us how to care for others, but there's not much about like how do we care for ourselves? How do we have boundaries? How do we create space for ourselves? So that's where I came up with this idea of the way of spiritual fortitude, and the way that I have defined it is, Molly, if you want to drop this in the definition. And before I read it, Therese, just wondering, where have you seen those realities? Have you seen that in your own kind of work and circles, the stress and the lack of ability to care for ourselves?
Definitely. As a matter of fact, I served as chair of the care team on the Committee for Ministry in National Capital Presbytery. And one of the things that we did, among others, is that we started a listening campaign. And so we were going across the presbytery, listening to pastors at churches. And I think I told you this, Jeff, that sometimes when I was listening, I could hear that I could identify that someone was in trouble. And sure enough, eventually it would come to the light, certain things.
Yeah. And so I'm defining spiritual fortitude. Can you put the definition in the chat as this? The way of spiritual fortitude is developing the mental, emotional, and spiritual strength to bear pain, encounter adversity or temptation with courage by nurturing resilient spiritual practices where we learn to love ourselves, that we may then love and care for others. And for me, one of those resilient spiritual practices has been contemplation. In my own personal journey, I think I've really pressed in the contemplation practices over the course of the last 10 years or so. After reading Martin Laird's Into the Silent Land, just felt like silence, that sounds good. Let's go, let's try that for a while. And so I'm wondering first, how long have you been on the kind of contemplative spiritual journey yourself? Was this always been a part of who you are as a faith person?
It has, in a way. I don't know that, first of all, I think contemplative in terms of spirituality is a relatively modern term. And so I think, you know, a while back, people like that were doing this were called mystics, not so much contemplatives. And also, but when I was very young, my grandmother and grandfather lived with us. And my grandmother was, now I know, a contemplative, but a very spiritual person, a very prayerful person. And I was always underfoot with her. And I remember going into her bedroom and sitting on the bed with her. And she would pull out her prayer book and we'd say prayers together. And she'd tell me about her conversion story and, you know, things like that. So I think I had, and then also, through the 10th grade, I went to Catholic school. So I think in some ways I've sort of been brought up in that tradition in a way, though nobody was saying anything about being contemplative. And as a matter of fact, I could have some stories of Catholic school that don't sound contemplative at all. But, you know, I think that when I hear the word spiritual fortitude, and I looked it up for myself, the definitions, it sounds very worldly to me, spiritual fortitude. It sounds like, you know, the life is tough and we've got to make our way through it, you know, kind of thing. Where I think what happens in contemplation is that one becomes more aware of themselves on a deeper level. So you get more in touch with the, as Thurman would say, the genuine in yourself, and also your relationship with the divine, or whatever we might call God. I know Matthew Fox says, if you can't read the Bible, look at nature. And so for myself, for example, I've used nature a lot to sort of explain to me or help me to understand eventually that, you know, everything that happens is not wonderful. And, you know, there are things we have to learn to deal with. But if you look at nature, they're for a reason. We have earthquakes and they shift the tectonic plates, probably keeps the earth up, you know, or helps in some kind of way. And we have rain and storms and everything, but that helps to nourish the ground. And we have volcanoes, and that creates new land masses. So I've started to look at my own struggles that way. That not to say that I'm always, you know, taking them with a halo over my head or anything, but I've learned that ultimately what I need to do is, what am I to learn from this? you know, this is happening.
Yeah.
What is
Yeah.
it that I need to learn about me, you know, about this situation? And so from doing that, what one of the things I've learned is to understand Teresa of Avila better when she talks about
Mm.
the interior castle and the spiral staircase. Basically, I think what she's saying is that all our lives we are spiraling around the same issues, but at different levels. Hopefully, we're maturing as we do that. Or so we can think of it as elevating, or we could go down and think of it as deepening. But those things, then I think you get to a point, not that nothing can ever shake you, but a lot of things that may have used to shake you, or you thought you really had to make it through and show how tough you are, you're able to just receive and receive the lesson that comes from it. So that's my
Yeah, I appreciate that that critique around the spiritual fortitude, the language of that, because it is like and I think part of that imagery of what I wanted to call up was a strengthening ourselves, a like we're gonna yeah, wrestle through this, or but there's a sense in contemplation that it's just a total, it's a letting go, it's a surrender. It's I appreciate what you said, like it's the knowing of ourself, the sound of the genuine within. And so let me throw this out there, Molly.
If I can just add one more thing to that, because you said that in the cloud of unknowing, he talks about, you know, the deepest, the most precious kind of contemplation is not knowing, you know, having what I think it's I'm not going to get this exactly right, but a learner's brain where you're always learning, you know, but you don't really have to have the answers for everything.
Yes, yes, yeah. Molly, could you put that other little survey in the chat around? I'm just curious about the folks that are on this call. How familiar are you with contemplated practices, or how much of a contemplation maybe is a part of your spiritual journey on a scale of 1 to 10? Yeah, I think, Therese, some of that, like not knowing that you were just talking about. I think when I first came to like this place where I was like, I'm now going to be a contemplative, and I felt like it was going to be my way into knowing, like it was going to be the secret, the magic trick, right? That I was going to be able to like enter into these really silent spaces and quiet myself. And I don't know if I was really on target, you know, St. John of the Cross, apparently, you know, there some of the lore is he floated, right? He would kind of, you know, maybe I could attain that. I've been doing this for 10 years. That hasn't been happening. What's your experience of that kind of space of contemplation of I don't know. I don't know even know what I'm trying to ask
I
here.
think
I
we're
guess
always becoming, you know, so you know, so we're always learning and becoming and getting to know ourselves and the divine at a deeper level. And hopefully as we are becoming, I don't know if it gets easier all the time depending on what it is, but at least for me, at least for now, I have some peace knowing that this is just the way things are. You know, this is the way the world is, and we continue to grow and develop and to learn until we're not here anymore, and then we pass it on to the next generation. So I also see this as I say to people all the time about race issues, that this is not a sprint or a marathon, it's a relay race. But I think life is probably a relay race where we get to a certain point and then we pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah, yeah. We've been talking a little bit kind of generically about contemplative practice, spirituality. Are there specific practices that really feed your soul? You talked about being out in nature, obviously, is one, but other like more specific practices.
I call myself anyway, like practicing the presence. That's something that Brother Lawrence used to do. Like, so he would talk about washing the dishes and being in the presence of the divine. I call myself practicing the presence, but I use a Lakota Sioux saying that says, let everything you do be your religion, and let everything you say be your prayer. So although I may not be using words, and I may not be doing something that looks like it belongs in church or whatever, you know, I am giving my life, myself to the divine, to the holy, in everything that I'm doing. And sometimes I mess up. Sometimes I'm not, you know, giving myself maybe as well as I should, but I think that's just part of being human.
Yeah. And how is silence and stillness a part of that for you?
So silence is okay, but you know, I'm a person of color. I'm a person of African descent. I've done my DNA, so I also know that my ancestors were those who came through the Middle Passage. I'm no doubt carry a trauma gene, and I have had trauma in my life, and I have seen trauma pass on in my family. Certain things have happened generation after generation after generation. And so I forgot the question. What was the question?
Silence and stillness as part of your practice.
So I think that silence is okay, but may not be the place to start with everyone. Sometimes if people are going through things, or maybe they're experiencing a trauma you don't know about or whatever, silence can bring all of that to the surface, and maybe they can't deal with it or whatever. So when I'm sitting across from my directees, I always suggest silence. It's good for me to sort of take that time to orient, you know, where we are, and to see myself in the room with the person and sort of give myself over. But at the same time, I have learned that everybody cannot tolerate silence, and so that it is something that you should ask if it's okay to do and not impose on others.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's really helpful, and I think important to recognize, you know, that contemplation, it kind of has more. It's been given to us or served to us more from a European outlook, like the mystics of the European kind of landmass. And when I was, and I think you went through the Shalem Institute, right? You're part of the Shalem Institute, and when I did their leading contemplative prayer groups and retreats certificate program, I was noticing a lot of, you know, just kind of whiteness, Europeanness in the readings, and had to like search for like Black contemplatives, which is where I first encountered Barbara Holmes and Joy Unspeakable. Could you talk a little bit more about, you know, what the Black experience, the Indigenous experience brings to us from contemplation?
Well, let me say that I've been connected to Shalem since 1989. So that's about 32 years. And I went there because I happened to be in a bookstore. I love books. And so, and I can't go in a bookstore and not come out with a book. Now, whether I read it or not is something else.
Yeah.
But anyway, I found this book in the bookstore called Soul Friend by Tilden Edwards. Tilden Edwards is the founder of Shalem. And I didn't know who he was. I just saw Soul Friend, and it felt like something I needed about then. So I started reading this book, realized they were in the DC area, and they had these people called spiritual directors. I think I could use one of those. So I called them up and said, I'm looking for a spiritual director. And they said, well, we're having an open house next week or something like that. It was soon. And why don't you come down? And at the time they were in a church that was just around the corner from the cathedral. And why don't you come down and join us? And so I went to the open house, and they were offering some small groups, and they were getting ready to test a group on contemplative prayer. So I joined the group on contemplative prayer, which was a 6-week group, and then they had another one following it. It was successful, so they followed it with a 6-month group, and I attended all kinds of other programs. I didn't end up in the spiritual guidance program until about 20 years later. And when I joined the spiritual guidance program, what you see now is better. It's not really much better, but it's better than what I saw, which was no persons of color as mentors or leaders or anything like that. No books, not recommended or otherwise, from people of color. So when at the end we were asked to do a final paper, you may know from your own experience, they break things into themes. And so you could write on a theme, or you could write on one of the mystics that they held up, or you could do a research paper. So I decided I would do a research paper, which it was more of an exploration than a research paper, but I did interview several, about 20 people of color, and I read about 20 books, additional books to their bibliography, which is pretty big, and wrote a paper called Black Spirituality and the Art of Spiritual Direction, because they did not address that, and I realized it. And so I got some pushback. They told me my paper was not contemplative. And I told them to go to the director at the time and let her read it. And if she said it wasn't contemplative, I would try to rewrite it. Otherwise, I was not going to, it took a lot to do that, you know. And so anyway, I don't know if they ever did that or not, but eventually I got this beautiful letter comparing my paper to a pianist who writes a tune and then plays it at a concert. And the way he plays it in the concert is interpreted by the way he wrote it, but the people who receive it may not receive it the way he wrote it. So this is the way that this person was saying about, you know, the conflict with my paper. So it published, it was received by Shalane, and then the very next year it published in Spiritual Directors International's Presence journal. So I think it is important, and I know it's a conversation that I've been in with Shalane for years, that they do have people of color represented, and that they do receive some of the other ways that people of color, as Barbara Holmes pointed out. And Barbara Holmes, by the way, was one of those books that I uncovered at the time. That there are other ways to be contemplative than silence. There's nothing wrong with silence per se, except as I said earlier, depending on who you're talking to, who you're dealing with. And they don't even necessarily have to be a person of color. People who have experienced or are carrying trauma of some kind may find silence uncomfortable. So if you want to introduce them to silence, you should do so slowly.
And there's almost a sense in some of Barbara's writing of the spiritual noise, maybe is a good way of putting it, being drawn forth from us when we set ourselves in like a space before God. The moans, I believe she talks about, you know, of our spirit.
Yeah, yes. And one of the things she talks about, like in the music, is particularly in Black music, there is a hook usually to a song. And if you go to a church, you know, there's this one hook. Those are intended to bring you into the presence of the holy. That's what it's for. You keep saying it over and over again in the song. It may have some rhythm to it, but eventually it takes you to another level than just singing a song, reading the words out of a book or something like that. So yes.
Like expanding our contemplative universe so much beyond silence and stillness and solitude, which are important things, but how we are contemplative in our noise and in our music, and how certain music is really designed to draw us in very contemplative kind of space.
Yeah, but you can even, like, if you go to a concert, if you go to a classical concert, the music can draw you into different places. But I want to say one more thing, and this is related to the book I wrote on Harriet Tubman, is that in Indigenous belief, and Harriet Tubman carried some Indigenous beliefs. She was only like 2 generations removed from those who came through the Middle Passage. And so they taught each other, the things that they learned in their own culture. But in Indigenous mysticism, your mysticism, first of all, the supreme being, as that person may be called, is not really accessible. And so there are other elements, spirits and ancestors, and then the people on the earth, the animals, the land, and the energy they bring with them that mediates from the supreme being down to the natural world. And so they believe that the gifts that they receive of the spirit are always meant for community. So where European thought is that being contemplative is oneness with God, and so now you are a god yourself or something. In Indigenous belief, those gifts are given to you to help your community and the world around you.
So it sounds like in some ways, European mysticism contemplation is a little more individualized. For what you're saying right there is much more communal, how the contemplative is carried into the community, that it doesn't just end in the individual, that there is a response that is called forth.
And now you bring me to my favorite quote. I don't. There's a book. It may be a little complex actually in my reading, but I would like to try to read it to you.
Oh, please do.
When I was at a spiritual directors international conference in Houston, on the Monday after the conference, they usually have some kind of pilgrimage of whatever the city is you're in, and it usually has some kind of religious overtones or sacred overtones to it. And so we went to the Rothke Chapel. Have you heard of that? So it's like a round building, and Rothke is an artist, except his art is like framed and there's nothing, maybe some color, but nothing is really there. It's blank.
Oh, that kind of art.
Yeah. And so you go into this round, like it's like a chapel. It's like a round.
Okay.
You go into the chapel and you sit on the benches and you stare at nothing actually. But I guess the idea is to draw you into that contemplative space. What is it that you might imagine from the blankness on the walls or whatever? What kinds of thoughts does it bring to you? And so it was interesting. I'm glad I went. So when I left there, I went out. They had a little cabinet with some books in it, and there was a book there called Contemplation in Action in World Religions. And from being raised Catholic and then kind of experimenting with a whole lot of things before I ended up at the PCUSA, I kind of like having that worldview.
Yeah, a theological mutt. You're a theological mutt, Therese. That's what I like to call it.
And so anyway, I got this book, and I want to read this to you about it's in the chapter entitled Traditional Methods of Contemplation and Action. It may seem a little complicated, but this is the editor, Elamaya Zola, writing before you actually read the content in the chapter. He's explaining contemplation and action. And he says, modern humans are constantly tempted to seek spiritual life in sheer method, or else in some kind of blind rapture, ringing with spontaneity and rich in creativity. Contemplation needs both. Method in itself leads only to disputation and quarrels. On the other hand, inspiration in itself, without the help of method, will lead to vain strivings toward creativity for its own sake. Contemplation soars above the archetypes and from these back up to the point from which everything arises. Action is linked to the Greek word agonia, which led to agony. Action in itself is always a sacrifice. When we leave the paradise of contemplation and descend to the earth of action, everything, including mystical action, becomes sacrificial. But agonia signifies struggle, contest, as well as anguish, and esoterically speaking, an unseen warfare. It may well be that the point of failure in contemporary civilization was precisely the failure to realize the necessity of constantly fighting against evil. So action is part of contemplation. It's not separate from that or something that we do and then we go contemplate to rest or something. But contemplation should always lead to action.
And is there a way that you feel like contemplation shapes that action in a certain way?
I think because at least my experience of contemplation is one of learning about myself, learning about the world, trying to understand how the world works and what my role is here. All of those things lead me to know more of why I'm here. I personally believe we're all here for a purpose. Whether we all fulfill that purpose is something different. But I think that we're here to help sustain life on this planet. All of us, trees and everything.
And that kind of gets us to the space of like the struggle with what we're talking about, the terms of like pastors that are all about action, but neglect the kind of space of caring for themselves first. And what I'm hearing here is this like call of like the deepening of our life in God that then propels us into this action. And I was listening to your podcast, your conversation with Sarah earlier, and you talked about finding what is ours to do. And could you just, because I thought it was very helpful, finding what is ours
there
to
are many
do.
things that we can do. And I just think about, for example, with George Floyd's murder and then a variety of other murders that happened around that time. And people took to the streets in DC. And I remember that at least in the environment I was in, if you hadn't taken to the streets, then you weren't a real person to deal with or something like that. But that's not everybody's call. And Howard Thurman himself, by the way, was berated because he did not walk with Martin Luther King when they protested, but he helped to ground the civil rights movement in contemplative practice, so that when they were facing the water hose or the people spitting on them or the dogs, they were able to keep a certain balance and not lose it, because if they did, they would probably end up dead. So there is action and there is sacrifice, and it can be, painful at times. But everything is not for everybody. We all have different calls. And I would even go further to say that what was my call when I was 16, perhaps, is somewhat similar now because I've picked up writing again. And at some point I got away from writing, but somewhat different. The things I'm doing now, like even talking to you about this, is different from what you would have heard from me at 16. So we are also evolving and becoming as we go along.
There's some of the questions I was asking us to reflect on last week was that, who have I been in Christ? Who am I in Christ? Who am I becoming in Christ? And this part of our conversation makes me think of at a prayer of Saint Ignatius, where he says, I want to know God more deeply. I want to love God more intimately, and I want to follow God more closely. Which may sound very familiar if you're familiar with Godspell and Day by Day. Oh dear Lord, these 3 things I pray. But I've always felt like the knowing God and the loving God intimately then should lead to the serving of God. And I think sometimes as leaders, spiritual leaders, we jump to the serving because we feel like that's what it means to be a disciple. I've got to follow Jesus and I got to do all the things. And we neglect the knowing God, which is also knowing ourselves, and the being in a loving, intimate relationship with God. And those I've found in my contemplative practice as it is, that's what contemplation helps me to do. It helps me know God, know myself a little bit more, have more of an experience of an intimate relationship with God, that then I'm finding like what is mine to do out of that space. So in kind of thinking about, let's talk about an indigenous mystic person, Jesus. What is your take on Jesus as a contemplative, and what does he model for us?
Internal liberation. Jesus was internally liberated. I'm an emotional emancipation circle facilitator. And so we call it emotional emancipation, but it's the same as internal liberation. Jesus did not allow the Pharisees, Sadducees, and whomever, the Sanhedrin and Rome, Caesar, whoever, to define who he was. And unfortunately for that, now we put him up on a pedestal and he's king and, conqueror and all of these different things. But what Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. And he was, the people that he was around were not just people that he, with his high mind and kind heart, went to help. He was one of them. And the difference between Jesus and them was that he self-differentiated. He believed enough and understood enough himself as an image bearer, in the image of God, that he was able to separate himself. And he was trying to teach them to do that. He wasn't just being that lofty person, and by himself and watching them be something different. He was actually trying to teach them that. And because he was in an oppressive society, and probably because he was showing too much self-direction, it got him killed. So
yeah,
that's how I see. And I get that from Thurman, the first chapter of Jesus and the Disinherited.
Yeah, and I noticed, there's scripture after scripture where Jesus, it says, as was his custom, kind of like got away. It doesn't say what he did in that space. We don't know if he was silent or, dancing or singing or whatever, but it's like, it said, as was his custom, he was constantly taking space away, often in wilderness, and at times where even his own disciples wouldn't be able to find him. And I've always felt that was whatever was happening there, it feels like very much a contemplative practice.
And he was also trying to get them to do the same thing. I'm thinking of one scene where he has been with the Sanhedrin or something, and they are going away and they're talking about what happened there. And he's saying to them, forget about them. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about us, what we should be doing, So he was constantly struggling with them to detach themselves, to free their minds, to have that internal liberation, as Thurman says, not being on the strings that someone else pulls, but finding the genuine in themselves. He was trying to tell them, you have the ability to be, someone of value, whether or not the Sanhedrin or Caesar or whoever accepts you or not. So the guy, one of them comes to him and with the coin and says, Caesar says we have to pay taxes. Should I give this to him? And he says, well, who's on this coin? Caesar. Well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, So, he's like, not affected at all by, you know, the dominant community. He lives in it and he has to deal with it, but he doesn't allow it to define who he is.
Thanks,
And in
Therese.
that way, I'd like to be like Jesus.
Yes, yes. I think we all would. Yes, that interior freedom that you speak about. Well, I definitely want to leave some space, because we're going to leave some space. Therese is going to lead us in a contemplative practice. But before we get there, I also want to leave some space for folks to ask you any questions. So if anybody wants to drop, and we had a request, Therese, could you put in the chat or let us know what the name of that book was that you read out?
Would it be okay? Are you able to communicate with these people afterwards? Because I can copy the name of the book and also the quote and send it to you,
Yeah.
Jeff. And okay.
Yeah. That'll be great.
Okay.
That'll be great.
It's kind of long, so I'm not going to be able to do it quickly in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So folks, if you want to, anybody have a question or part of this conversation you'd like to hear more about, or just something else about contemplation, either can use the raise your hand or type a question in the chat. And also, Therese, I would love to hear from you. What are some good resources or books that you recommend?
Boy.
Even just if it's a couple.
Which kind of book?
Around contemplation, around like what's helpful for us to, yeah.
So if you haven't, so some of them are old books. Like if you haven't read The Cloud of Unknowing, I recommend everybody read that book.
Yes.
And also Therese of Avila, who I think is funny. Her book, The Interior Castle. And also Mirabai Starr has a more modern version of Therese of Avila's story. And okay, so we're talking about contemplation. I'm not sure if this is directly contemplation, but I love this little book right here. It's a book of Psalms adapted from the Hebrew by Stephen Mitchell. And Stephen Mitchell,
I got that through the Shalem Institute. That's where I found that.
This is a beautiful book. So that if I'd known you were going to ask for books, I would have started writing them down. But you're asking me to
you know what?
include
that whenever you send me. Include your little list.
Okay.
That would be great.
I can do that. Yes.
Yeah, I had on my list that's in The Cloud of Unknowing is great. It's a mind bender, but it's kind of like the more you know, the less you know is basically kind of what it's saying.
And you just made me think of another book. Speaking of the cloud, made me think of Jerry May, who was one of the I don't know if he was a founder, but he was one of the first in the Shalem Institute. He was a military person, a psychiatrist, I think, in the military. And when he joined Shalem and everything, he called himself a contemplative psychologist. But he has a book called Will and Spirit. And that is my favorite Jerry May book. And it talks about humanity and how we are. And he talks about the difference between willingness and willfulness. He talks about evil. He talks about the difference between having an experience and then describing the experience. I just really love that book. He talks about a lot of things that I'd never heard in church before. So I enjoyed that book. I'll think of others and write them down and send them.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Carlos in the chat here. How has your Catholic formative years, your gender, and your race informed or hindered your contemplative practices?
I think that there's a good side and a bad side. when I was in Catholic school, you know, they were preparing us to become nuns and priests. Actually, that was the whole goal, probably. But we would go to church, and there would be once a week we would have confession. And I don't know if you're familiar with the name Monsignor. I mean, not Monsignor. He was Cardinal Cody. He was in Chicago, and he got in a lot of trouble because he messed up some money, you know. So when I was in Catholic school at Nativity in DC, he was Monsignor Cody, head of Nativity, the complex called Nativity Church in school. And so he was generally one of the two priests that we would have one day of the week to listen to our confessions. And our confessions were, you know, we were children. So I'm talking about maybe third or fourth grade or something. And so our confessions was like, I talked back to my mother today, you know. So anyway, getting to the story, we would walk over 2 by 2, and then we would get in a single line, either to one priest or the other. And when it looked like to the nuns, too many of us were getting in the other priest line, they would make us go stand in the line to Cardinal Cody, who you could hear from the confessional saying, "You did what?" One day I went to him and confessed and told him I was talking back to my mother. And he said, and so you know, your penance after confession is that you go up to the altar and pray, and you have a rosary. So he may say, pray the rosary 1 time or something. But he told me to pray the Lord's Prayer 10 times and the Hail Mary 25 times or something like that, so that everybody was lined up 2 by 2 to go back to school. And I was still on the altar praying. So, you know, everybody's looking at you. What did she do? And so that's the dark side of being a Roman Catholic. But I think that one way that they have helped me is the way they develop my mind. And so I'm able to interpret a lot of things and to understand a lot of things that maybe would be more difficult for someone who hadn't had that experience.
What about just being a Black woman? Has that informed or how has that informed or hindered your contemplative practice? That's the other part of Carla's question.
I love being a Black woman. And I think that I go to God as a Black woman. And I think God loves Black women and Black men, you know, Amen. Black people. And so you know, there are things that happen that I don't like, but I am in that place that I described to you, where instead of really obsessing about it or being pained, I do get pained sometimes, but what I try to do is to make sense of it. Why is this happening? You know, what is it that I need to learn right here? Or what do I need to let go of? Or, you know, is it me or is it the other person? You know, different things like that.
Yeah. Thanks. Any other questions for Therese? I realize we haven't touched on spiritual direction. Would you just want to talk a little bit about like the importance of spiritual direction, or why? I mean, we kind of heard a little bit of story why you founded the network, but how can spiritual direction be one of those resilient practices that help us in this?
So, you know, I wrote another article in SDI's Present magazine, this one in March 2014, called Spiritual Direction as Sacred Activism. And one of the things that I was pointing out, if not totally in that article, but that occurred to me, is I can remember as a teenager, you know, you have 1,000 problems or 99 problems. And you have your best girlfriend and you're up all night telling her your 99 problems. And when you become an adult, you don't have people that are accessible like that anymore to tell your 99 problems. As a matter of fact, nowadays, people don't want to hear your one problem. You know, they just don't want to get involved if they don't have to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so for me, the thing, okay, repeat the question.
What was my question, Molly? Where spiritual direction. How the importance of
spiritual direction. So spiritual directors, I get off on my own stories and then I forget what the subject was. But anyway, spiritual direction, people who are doing spiritual direction are making space and time for people to talk about themselves. Something that we don't really get to do in this culture. It's getting worse, you know, in this culture. And during the pandemic, I know mine and a lot of other people's spiritual direction practices just doubled, you know, with people who needed to talk through what was happening and they didn't have access to their normal community of people. And so spiritual direction allows for that. And in my own practice, allowing people, they may not stay with you long, allowing people to be able to just share about themselves, though, may make something surface where they need to go get help, you know, from someone who, but if they hadn't encountered the spiritual director, that may never come to they may keep, you know, shoving it down and it never come to a place where they can get the help to be healed for whatever is troubling them. So I think that is a definite aspect of spiritual direction that is helpful. And then beyond that, it gives people the ability to talk through things, maybe hear other experiences, and to help with their own discernment of what is theirs to do. So that's what I believe spiritual direction offers.
Thanks. We've got another comment from Deborah. She said, I would appreciate hearing your thoughts about how white people can make use of your writing and teachers like Barbara Holmes, Howard Thurman, etc., respectfully in a non-supremacist way.
So if nothing else, you know, I was in National Capital Presbytery at one point. I helped to organize a community of people to kind of look at what racism might look like in National Capital Presbytery. And so we did a lot of listening to people. And so one of the things that I realized is that many white people just don't understand. It's not the way you live, you know. So unless you actually try to understand it, or unless you have Black friends who you're close enough with that they share with you some of the things they go through, you just don't understand what they're saying or doing. And maybe even if you have Black friends or something, you may not completely understand. So I think that writers like Howard Thurman and Barbara Holmes and James Cone and I can't think of everybody's name at the moment, you know, but those people can help you to understand what life looks like from our perspective. Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, you know, various people like that can help you to understand by reading out Zora Neale Hurston, by hearing our stories and seeing our stories. And I think that, you know, as I mentioned, fiction writers sort of now, like Zora Neale Hurston, you might read those books and think it's just fiction, but it's not. It is an interpretation of what it's like to be Black on this planet.
Yeah, I think Octavia Butler and Parable of the Sower and those, Deborah, you can come off mute if you want. Does that kind of get at what you were looking for? Is there a concern about using those writings in a way?
Well, I'm doing intentional anti-racism work in my congregation, and you know, there's resistance around that, and then people are sort of on the surface, oh, well, we read Dr. Thurman, and they sort of feel like they're no longer racist, kind of thing. In terms of,
yeah.
or, oh, we sang that, we're singing the Gloria Patri in Spanish now, so we're all good, and I'm working with folks to try to, I appreciate, I don't think I can introduce them to Zora Neale Thurston yet. I think we're a few steps away from that. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, like I'm always trying to check myself and make sure that I'm being respectful and careful, because even, using Indigenous writers or using, like I'm reading Claudio Carvalhos's book right now, one of his books right now, like there's a lot that white people just don't get. Like
Deborah, are there any people of color in your congregation?
We have one or two, but
is there a church near you with people of color?
I'm working on building that relationship with a church, with an African-American congregation. Yeah. In a different part
because that can help, just being in relationship with people of color.
Yeah. I think that's really what I have to do, is to help people draw near to one another. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Okay, we got another thought in the chat, or a request, wondering, kind of building off the Catholic and hearing your story about confession. Therese, do you know, is there a book that engages confession for someone with a Catholic background who is engaging in non-Catholic worshiping communities? I know of a person looking for a resource like this, as confession collectively feels different than going to confessional, and they are sorting through these thoughts.
I personally, Sabrina, don't know a book off the top of my head, but I'm sure if you go to Amazon and just put in there something like confession, or confession, or I'm looking for some other words that I saw here, or a collective confession. If you just put some words in, you could do Google or Amazon, it would probably bring up some books or some writings from people that you could then research. I really don't know personally, at least not right now, what books those might be.
I think of some, Sabrina, I think of some different prayer liturgy books, like the Celtic Daily Prayer book. Like there's different confessions in there, and the prayer book for ordinary radicals that came out a few years ago. I'm pretty sure there's some like good confessional material there. So yeah, I think a good Google search can come up with something hopefully helpful.
But I remember in National Capital Presbytery, when we were trying to talk about race during some of our meetings, we would use things like and also this happened at the General Assembly that I was called to as well. The Belhar Confession is beautiful. And so, I mean, it actually teaches.
Yeah.
And so that may be, and I know we used it to actually make a confession for the community to speak together. It's not a conference. I see one message here about what is the name of it's not a conference, it's a network called the Spiritual Directors of Color Network. And I was telling that story, and then about writing that paper. And then that was my first SDI conference that I went to after that. And we started gathering up people of color there, and found that there were people of color, not just Africans, but from around the world, who were saying, where are the other people like me? And how come no one's writing from people like me? So that's why we started writing books.
I wonder if Leanne, my dear friend Leanne, who will be with us next week, was referring to the Racial Awareness Festival. That's what
I don't see that.
Maybe. When she was asking about the conference you started. Is that what you're looking for, Leanne?
Yes, that was it. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. There's some good.
I don't know if I said
Good
this or
resources
not.
in
You
there.
asked about recordings earlier. We are going to
Yeah.
try. It won't happen this week, but we are going to try to put some recordings of a couple of the workshops and something that we patched together of the 2 plenaries for people to see.
Great. Great. Well, I want to give us some space, Therese, for you to help us center down and to lead us in a little contemplative space. One last resource I'll mention in terms of like podcasts is one called Turning to the Mystics by James Finley, who's with the Center for Action and Contemplation with Richard Rohr. And he's done a series, there's like 4 seasons. One's on Thomas Merton, one's on Teresa of Avila, one's on St. John of the Cross, and I think they just started another one. But they're very in-depth. If you want to go, I'm currently listening to the one on St. Teresa and reading The Interior Castle, and it's a great resource. Yes, Turning to the Mystics. Thanks, Molly. But I guess one last thing I'll say, Teresa, is, you know, I think for me, like my practice of contemplation over the years, I often in the moments of the contemplation, when I'm trying to be still or silent, or when I'm trying to do the Lectio Divina or there's many, I mean, my mind is going 100 different places, right? And it's just racing around. And sometimes I often feel like I'm not getting this right. You know, it's just not working out for me. Maybe I should find some other kind of practice. But then later in my day or in my week or in my interactions with the world, I find I'm responding differently maybe than I would have to some scenario or situation. I find it's anchoring. I've never done the levitation thing. It's never gotten me to some space where I've seen visions from God, but I find it to be like just an anchoring practice that I can't imagine kind of traveling without at this point.
And that's why they call it a practice. Because you have to do it, but then eventually you let go of the practice because it becomes part of you.
Thank you. Well, would you lead us in a practice?
Yes, and I'm going to combine 2 practices. One is Lectio Divina, which just in case there's somebody that doesn't know what that is, it's reading and then having in 3 stages at some point for a response, and then the last will be silence. I'm going to do that a little differently now. And the part where we will really go into the silence will be the centering prayer. But before we get there, I'm going to read a few quotes from some people. I'm centering this little time of practice around the idea of loving oneself. So there is a scripture that says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as yourself." The most distinctive dimension of Jesus's interpretation of the law is that he combines the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, with the commandment from Leviticus to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus neither neglected the love of God nor the love of neighbor. In Jesus's teaching, the love of God is intimately connected with the love of neighbor. And then this is just me talking, that we say love God and love neighbor, but Jesus said to love God and love neighbor as yourself. And so that assumes that there is love for yourself. And I think many times we don't have love for ourselves, but if we don't love ourselves well, we can't love others well. Carl Jung says that when we have an emotional reaction to another person, we're really projecting on that person something that we don't like about ourselves. So the first and foremost thing is to learn to love yourself, not in a narcissistic way, but in a way that shows that you are loved, that you love yourself as a child of God and a human being who is doing the best they can, maybe making mistakes, but learning along the way. And that takes internal freedom, emotional emancipation. So I'm going to read some quotes, one from Thurman called The Inward Sea. There is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there is an island. And on that island there is an altar, and standing guard before the altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon your altar unless it is part of the fluid area of your consent. And as I read each of these, if you just take a moment to take a deep breath, breathe in with a slow count of 2, and breathe out through your mouth with a slow count of 4. Second reading from Thurman. It has long been a matter of serious moment that for decades, and I put in brackets centuries, we have studied the various peoples of the world and those who live as our neighbors as objects of missionary endeavor and enterprise, without being at all willing to treat them either as brothers and sisters or human beings. It is not an issue in which vicious human beings are involved. It is one of the subtle perils of a religion which calls attention to the point of overemphasis sometimes to one's obligation to administer to human need. The issue is not what religion counsels them to do for others whose need may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their own needs. And one more Thurman quote. There is something in every one of you that waits, listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. And if you cannot hear it, you will never find whatever it is for which you are searching. And if you hear it and then do not follow it, it was better that you had never been born. You are the only you that has ever lived. Your idiom is the only idiom of its kind in all of existence. And if you cannot hear the sound of the genuine in you, you will all your life spend your days on the ends of strings somebody else pulls. And maybe one last Thurman. Follow the grain in your own wood. And then from Thomas Keating, God will bring people and events into our lives. And whatever we may think about them, they are designed for the evolution of God's life in us. And Thomas Keating also wrote, for human beings, the most daunting challenge is to become fully human. For to become fully human is to become fully divine. And then finally, one quote from Madeleine L'Engle. A self is not something static, tied up in a pretty parcel and handed to the child finished and complete. A self is always becoming. Being does mean becoming, but we run so far that it is only when we seem to stop, as sitting on the rock at the brook, that we are aware of our own isness of being. But certainly this is not static, for this awareness of being is always a way of moving from the selfish self, the self-image, towards the real. And now I ask you to sit back in your chair or your sofa. Let your back be supported by the back of the furniture that you're sitting on. Put your feet flat on the floor. Hold your palms upward, or you can take your fingers and touch the tips to both hands. And take 3 deep breaths at your own pace, breathing in through your abdomen, up through your diaphragm, into an open throat through your nose, to a slow count of 2. 1, 2. And then releasing through your mouth to a slow count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now do that 2 more times on your own at your own pace. And I will ring the bell for us to go into a few minutes of silence. And now if there is a word or phrase from some of the reading that I gave or something that came to you in the silence, can you either write it in the chat or unmute yourself and say it out loud? And don't, if you unmute yourself, don't worry about running into other people.
Becoming.
In the chat is follow the grain in your own wood in Ireland. Genuine, altar. Love yourself to love others. And I think we're just about out of time, so let's pray. This is the last part of Psalm 90 from a book of Psalms by Stephen Mitchell. Teach us how short our time is. Let us know in the depths of our souls. Show us that all things are transient, as insubstantial as dreams, and that after heaven and earth have vanished, there is only you. Fill us in the morning with your wisdom. Shine through us all our lives. Let our hearts soon grow transparent in the radiance of your love. Show us how precious each day is. Teach us to be fully here, and let the work of our hands prosper for a little while. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Therese.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being with us. Thank you, friends, for being here tonight. I will be sending out email with a list of the different resources and the information that was also in the chat for folks. If you registered for this series, then you'll automatically get that. If you did not register and just grab this link from somewhere, just send me a private message here with your email, and I'll gladly include you on that list. Next week, I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation around waves of spiritual fortitude with my dear friend Leanne Younger. Leanne's a church planner here in Pittsburgh. She planted City View Church, and she is currently getting a master's degree in theology with an emphasis on decolonization, which is a word we've been hearing a lot. And I thought it would be fun to have a conversation with Leanne around decolonizing our practice and how that can be a way of actually caring for ourselves and helping us care for others better. So Leanne, can you say hello? And is there anything you want to say about next week?
Hello. I am looking forward to next week, and I do everything Jeff tells me to do, so I didn't really have a choice.
I really feel like Leanne and I have these conversations often, and it's just going to be like us having a conversation with a bunch of people kind of listening in. So, but looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to interacting with everybody, and I hope you all will be here. So go in peace, my friends. And thank you, Therese. So great to be
Peace.
with you. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. I'll send you those things.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Thank you, Therese.
Thank you. Glad to be with you all.